Jazz is an indefinable music genre that spans decades of evolution and change, creating a sound that is both recognizable yet impossible to correctly define. It is a genre that is inherently unpredictable, thriving off of improvisation and spontaneous composition. Yet, it is also a genre of tradition and the shattering of said tradition for the purpose of new sound. Jazz is an essential part of America's cultural history, beginning over a century ago in the hearts of African American musicians. Truthfully, jazz has roots before the black communities of New Orleans. The traditional rhythms and motifs of dozens of African tribes were carried over to the Americas and put under the pressure of slavery. Forbidden from their own culture and music, African slaves adapted, altering and implementing their culture into that of their captors. The songs they sang while working, the sound they preached in prayer, and every note played in between contributed to the birth of jazz. Time passed and music evolved, creating the two most important components of the inception of jazz: ragtime and blues. Ragtime was the most popular dance music of the late 1800s and early 1900s, but differed from jazz tremendously in that it was meant to be performed the same way each time and primarily on the piano. Where the two had similarities was in the irregular, syncopated sounds they incorporated. Talented black musicians took up the genre and began to make it their own. The limited instruments available to blacks at the time, piano, banjo, trombone, and some others, were added to this sound. Some musicians couldn't read the music. Improvisation became commonplace. Scat singing popularized, and in the mid-1910s, jazz was born. Some notable talents of the time were Buddy Bolden, who's legendary for never being recorded, Buddy Petit, Freddie Keppard, and Sidney Bechet. Currently, ensemble improv was the style, as the improvised solo had not quite emerged as the standard for jazz. Storyville was the region of New Orleans that was currently the jazz capital, but in 1917, Storyville was closed. Jazz artists spread throughout the country, many heading to Chicago or to play on riverboat orchestras. The new jazz center became Chicago, where swing would form. As jazz rose in popularity, imitators of course rose, the most notable being an ensemble of white musicians known as the Original Dixieland Jazz Band, who were the first to make a jazz record. Enter the Jazz Age. Jazz was big, jazz was popular. The Prohibition in America created illegal speakeasies where jazz artists entertained guests as they drank and socialized. At this time, jazz was a popular form of dance music, the style of swing growing throughout the 1920s, pioneered largely by Louis Armstrong, trumpeter and vocalist. In the late 1910s and early 20s, Armstrong began to popularize improvised solos as well, and was often a featured performance in other bands. He was, if you will, among the first jazz superstars. His innovations to jazz and the development of swing have made waves for decades and directly led to the popular swing era of the 1930s. Also around this time, orchestral jazz was developing largely due to the efforts of Fletcher Henderson and Duke Ellington. The two took different approaches, but were nonetheless innovative and key to the evolution of jazz. Unfortunately, the racial segregation that existed throughout the 20s and 30s prevented their ensembles from gaining immense popularity. The likes of Benny Goodman or the Casa Loma Orchestra were more successful. Ellington in particular had trouble growing a market due to his band's more nuanced pieces that were unpopular among the swing crowd. Other popular groups included Jelly Roll Morton's Red Hot Peppers, Paul Whiteman's Orchestra, and William McKinney's Cotton Pickers. Jazz entered the 1940s, and with the change in decade came a change in style. A distinct style known as bebop developed. Bebop strayed away from swing and dance and moved towards something less mainstream. The style can be identified by its generally faster tempos, since no one was quite meant to dance to it, along with an abundance of syncopation and accents. Bands became smaller once again, usually in combos of trios or quartets. These groups usually stayed around Chicago, New York, or Los Angeles, where studio work was plentiful and profitable. Duke Ellington's career began to soar, eventually becoming one of the biggest jazz artists in history. Other players of the 40s and 50s included Tommy Potter, Charlie Parker, Miles Davis, Dizzy Gillespie.
You accent the P. You see, you must accent the P. You must not accent the nut. You must not say salt peanut, salt peanut. You say salt peanut, salt peanut. See, there is a difference.
Thelonious Monk, and Max Roach. The 40s and 50s also became a great period for singers like Nat King Cole, the queen of jazz herself, Ella Fitzgerald, and Frank Sinatra, among many others. Jazz was also bleeding into and meshing with other musical styles, particularly Afro-Cuban. The earliest of Latin jazz, Afro-Cuban jazz, emerged in the early 40s with Mario Bauza and Frank Grillo Machito. Dizzy Gillespie collaborated with Cuban percussionist Chano Pozo in 47, bringing new sound to the East Coast jazz scene. Cool jazz and modal jazz developed in the late 40s and throughout the 50s. Cool jazz frontrunners consisted of Miles Davis, the Modern Jazz Quartet, Chet Baker, and others. In the aftermath of the tense, rapid, and complex post-World War II bebop era, jazz took on a softer, calmer feel to it that would be the basis of cool jazz. In the late 50s, this altered into modal jazz, also spearheaded by the likes of Davis. Modal jazz held melody rather than harmony as its basis for improvisation and progression. However, at the same time, hard bop, a post-bop style of bebop that incorporates gospel influences blues, was formed, led by the quintet Art Blakey and the Jazz Messengers. John Coltrane, and once again Miles Davis, also had success in this style of jazz. Moving into the late 50s and 60s, free jazz took hold. Ornette Coleman and Cecil Taylor are largely credited as being among the very first free jazz artists. They released the album Free Jazz, a collective improvisation, coining the term. Popular artists like John Coltrane also developed free jazz, a style that was originally controversial in the jazz community for its many deviations and disregard for the traditional sounds and techniques. Coltrane's work grew more abstract, combos played with more freedom. Free jazz would find a significant foothold in Europe during the 60s and 70s. The 60s was also a time for Latin jazz to rise again in the styles of Afro-Cuban and Brazilian jazz. Throughout the 1970s, jazz would become increasingly varied and mixed with other styles and genres of music. Jazz fusion was the name of the game during this decade. Jazz began meshing and melding with all types of music genres from soul and funk, to rock, to disco, and to even more Latin jazz. As the decade closed out and jazz entered the 80s, the constant evolution of the genre began to subside some. The 80s was a period of traditionalist revival. It's debated whether the cause of this revival period was a kind of response to the free jazz and jazz fusion movements, but after decades of constant change every 5 to 10 years, jazz fell into a brief stagnation. An easily marketable, commercially successful form of jazz, smooth jazz, came about at this time as well, along with a very familiar face for most people, Kenny G. Smooth jazz had a slow tempo, and the lead melody was often played by something like a saxophone or an electric guitar. In the late 80s and into the 90s, with hip-hop, R&B, rap, and punk becoming increasingly popular, jazz also melded these genres into the umbrella, creating punk jazz, jazzcore, new jazz, acid jazz, and jazz rap. Today, no single style of jazz dominates the genre, but rather, jazz extends across many different sounds and places around America and the world. The genre has permeated every aspect of American culture, from movies to games. Jazz has been in cinema for years, most especially early musicals. Some more recent examples include Whiplash, telling the story of a young jazz percussionist and his malevolent instructor.
Not quite my tempo. Here we go. 5, 6, and...
And the Oscar-winning La La Land, which portrays the love story of an obsessive jazz traditionalist and an aspiring actress in the backdrop of LA. Jazz has also made its way into blockbuster animated films, a notable example being The Incredibles, with heavy influence from jazz and the music of James Bond movies. Jazz has even been a major influence in video games, most recent, the smash indie hit Cuphead, which features a soundtrack inspired by 30s swing and 40s bebop, and visuals directly inspired by the old Disney cartoons of the 30s and 40s. There is no doubt jazz has been an important part of America's cultural development, and continues to be at this very moment. In our very school, we have 4 different jazz-related groups that have been practicing year-round, preparing now for the Night of Jazz in May. Perhaps you're turned off by what you have heard about jazz. But in a genre so diverse and expansive, it's worth a look into the past of the music and appreciate it this month of jazz appreciation, and every month after.